Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Really looking forward to this session. The speaker at the session is Jeremy Koons of Georgetown University in Qatar, and he'll be speaking on Sellars on external reasons.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, so let me, I guess it would help if I actually started presenting my PowerPoint here. Okay. There we go. All right. Can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
All right. Great. So the question that I want to talk about is whether moral reasons are, as it were, objectively binding, objectively valid, which is, are they binding on all rational agents? Now, Bernard Williams has a very well-known essay, internal and external reasons, and he's talking about internal and external reasons in the sense of justifying reasons. And the basic idea is that, of course, Williams famously argues that there are no external reasons, there are only internal reasons. And the basic idea of an internal reason is a reason that somehow appeals to your pre-existing motivational set. And Williams's argument is roughly, the conclusion. So if you think that there are only internal reasons, then basically think what you think is that if something doesn't somehow connect to your motivational set, then you can't possibly have a justificatory reason for doing it. And that's very plausible with regard to a wide range of things. If you have no desire to play tennis, then you don't have any reason to buy a tennis racket. It's more troubling with regard to other things, with, say, morality, for example. A person who has no desire to be moral suddenly now has no reason to be moral. So the idea that there could only be internal reasons is often thought to be problematic for the project of morality. And so the alternative is to try to argue that there are external reasons, which is reasons that are binding on people regardless of their psychology, regardless of their subjective motivational set. Either way, it seems like these two options that we're left with, internal and external reasons, if you want to argue that that morality is objectively valid, then it seems like you have two options. So on the one hand, you have to argue that there are, in fact, external reasons, contra Williams, and that moral reasons are among these. Or you could argue, on the other hand, that reasons are internal, but in fact, everybody happens to share a moral motive, happily. Now, Sellars argues that the moral imperative is, in fact, objectively valid. And so should we attribute to Sellars a version of A or a version of B? Well, I'm going to argue that, as is so often the case, Sellars' solution doesn't really fit very neatly into either slot, I don't think. So first, I'm going to argue that Sellars' collective approach to rationality enables a radical critique of the Humean theory of reasons, which is often the foundation of the attack on external reasons. And second, I'm going to argue that this approach generates an account on which moral reasons are objectively valid. Now, since most of an individual's reasons cannot be understood in isolation from the reasons of others and in isolation from the individual's embeddedness in a community's norms and institutions, there are going to be a large range of reasons that the agents are subject to merely in virtue of being rational agents. There's a plausible argument that moral reasons are among these. However, the bindingness of these reasons doesn't fit neatly into either the internalist or the externalist model. Okay, now I will say before I start that the project I'm pursuing here is a little bit like, I think, in the spirit of what Nicholas Tebben was doing on the first day. It's not intended to be exegetical. Rather, I'm taking, Sellars had a very radically social conception of agency and rationality. And I don't think it's often appreciated how radically social his conception of agency and rationality was. And I think what I want to do is to try to take that and see where it leads us with regards to issues like the Humean theory of reasons and the question of internal versus external reasons. And I'm going to argue that that brings us back around roughly to where Sellars wanted to get us at the end of Science and Metaphysics, Chapter 7, to the objective validity of morality. Okay, so I'm going to start with a terminological clarification. For Sellars, acting on a norm is a special case of acting on a reason. So on the expressivist account, which I take it most people here are familiar with, norms are basically normative proprieties which are implicit in practice, and an explicit statement of a norm merely makes explicit these implicit proprieties. So, for example, there are moral norms, when in these circumstances do this action. There are theoretical norms, such as Fifi is a mammal, implies that Fifi is a chordate, and so on. Now, since norms have a rule-like structure, they have the structure of basically a conditional, the antecedent of a binding norm is a reason. So norms are specially kinds of socially instituted reasons, in other words. So, for example, when I'm acting on a norm, which we might express by saying, when in circumstances I do action I, then my reason for doing action I will be that I'm in circumstances I, or at least my recognition that I'm in circumstances I. So in what follows, I'm going to speak both of being bound by reasons and also by being bound by norms. Other reasons may be partially non-institutional. I doubt if any reasons are fully non-institutional, but anyhow, we'll talk about different kinds of reasons as we go on. Okay. Now, Humeans, people who are Humeans about reasons, often deny that moral norms have objective validity, or they have struggled to explain how they could have such validity. Into the former camp fall thinkers like Alan Goldman, who argues that moral norms are rationally optional. Basically, Goldman's idea is that states of affairs are constituted as reasons for you by your desires. So the fact that, we'll get to some examples in a second, but the implication is that if you don't have the relevant desire, then the state of affairs can't be constituted as a reason for you. So no desire, no reason. And ergo, Goldman is going to conclude that moral norms are rationally optional. If you don't have the relevant set of desires, you don't have moral reasons. So other Humeans, like Mark Schroeder, argue that moral reasons are valid for everyone because everyone has some kind of moral motive, but they offer arguments that I think rely to some extent on speculation and promissory notes. So part of the problem with the Humean approach, I think, is that they offer an explanation of reasons that is almost always individualistic and often reductionist. So consider, for example, Schroeder's account of what it is for a person to have a reason. So borrowing Brian Epstein's model of diagramming grounding relations, we can model how reasons are grounded as follows. Now, this looks super complicated, but we can ignore most of the complications in Epstein's diagram. What is going to be useful for us is what's going on in the white box, which I've circled in red, namely the relationship between the reason and what grounds the reason. So in this example, that there will be dancing at the party is a reason for Ronnie to go to the party because Ronnie desires to dance. And the fact that there will be dancing at the party is part of what explains why Ronnie's going to the party will satisfy his desire to dance. So, the fact that there's dancing at the party is a reason for him to go to the party because he has the desire to dance. Now, it's a pretty straightforward account of what it is to have a reason, an account that is both reductive and individualistic. In fact, Schroeder is very explicit that his account is a reductive one. It analyzes reasons, a normative category, wholly in non-normative terms. And I think it's also an individualistic one because it analyzes them in terms of the desires of individual agents for whom the reasons in question obtain or fail to obtain. So the reductionism and the individualism are clear from this account of reasons. So elsewhere, I've argued at some length that reductionist accounts of the normative fail, and that this failure is in principle and unavoidable. That's not what I'm here to talk about today. I have a different set of concerns. The specific set of concerns I have today are whether any plausible account of reasons could be individualistic in this way. That's the question that I have for today. Okay, so let's get to asking the question of whether a plausible account of reasons can be individualistic in the way that people like Schroeder and Goldman say. So Humeanism offers account of reasons based on individual agents, say their psychological states as constituting states of affairs as reasons. So I suggest that some reasons are themselves necessarily social or intersubjective, examining the necessarily social nature of some kinds of reasons and what kinds of reasons are binding on us qua socially constituted rational agents. I think this is going to help us see how we can get in the ballpark of the conclusion that Sellars tried to prove in the concluding pages of Science and Metaphysics, Chapter 7, or rather the conclusion that he said he couldn't prove. But I think that he actually gives us the tools to do so. All right, so to begin with, certain kinds of reasons can, I think, clearly only be intersubjective. So they can't be individual reasons. So these reasons depend either conceptually or ontologically on others having the same reasons, or at least a suitably complementary set of reasons. Maybe not in each individual case, but in general. So consider team sports. Pick your favorite team sport. Pick some kind of play in team sports. For example, for a given basketball player, the general tactic of executing a particular play, like a pick and roll, is not rationally independent of the other player's part in this play, and their expectation that you're going to screen her defender if you're the ball handler, or that you're going to roll to the basket and receive the ball if you are the screener, as it were. So while in any individual case, players might have reason to execute a pick and roll, even if the ball handler rationally decides not to pass you the ball, or even make use of your screen. As a general matter, no one could ever have a reason to execute a pick and roll unless ball handlers at least sometimes had a reason to set up such plays and pass the ball to the now undefended player. So once again, we can now model this using the graph as before. And once again, you can just ignore the everything except for what's in this white box up here. Now, what's novel about this new model, and what's different, what distinguishes this new model from the one that Schroeder has, is now there's a biconditional between my reason, or between Smith's reason and Jones's reason. So both reasons must be simultaneously and interdependently grounded. So neither Smith nor Jones can have a reason without the other one having a complementary reason. The reasons are interdependent in this way. And structurally similar examples can be repeated with multiple kinds of cooperative plays, with every team sport, and indeed, I think with every kind of cooperative endeavor. Most of our reasons, I think, depend on the general existence of similar or complementary reasons had by other rational agents with whom we are cooperating. So this is an example of what I'm going to call rational interdependence. So with rational interdependence, the category of reasons is not created by a system of norms. However, one person's strategy is rationally dependent on another person's strategy, and vice versa. There just is no self-standing analysis of what I have a reason to do or what you have a reason to do. There is only an analysis of what we have a reason to do. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about rational interdependence because I frankly think it's the least interesting kind of interdependence for our purposes. The more interesting kind is what I'm going to call institutional interdependence. Now, Searle famously argues that humans create institutions through a process of mutual agreement or joint acceptance. In doing so, we create roles such as president or chief. We create rights, obligations, and various what he calls deontic powers. Now, most of what we do in society depends on this system of norms, independently of which we cannot even describe our actions, much less elaborate on our reasons for performing these actions. Now, crucially, through the existence of such institutions, we acquire new capacities to do things we couldn't do before, couldn't in the strongest possible sense, because these activities literally did not exist before they were instituted by this system of norms. So for example, suppose I have a reason to buy a computer. The very act of buying anything is institutionally dependent on the deontic powers created by the institution of property, the rights it gives me, the obligations it gives others, and the reasons that arise out of these new norms. We can once again model the reason relation in a way that demonstrates its fundamental interdependence among the reasons of multiple agents. And once again, you see that when you talk about something like buying a computer, the very existence of the rights that you obtain via buying a computer is interdependent with the obligations that are created with other people. And both of those are independently and simultaneously grounded in a particular set of circumstances. And what I'm going to argue in a second is that this equivalence between your rights and other people's obligations creates an interdependent set of reasons such that neither is intelligible apart from the other. Okay, so what we see from examples like this is that my reason to buy a computer institutionally depends on the very institution of property and on the mutual acceptance of the norms of property, and that also conceptually depends upon others' observance of these norms. The reasons embodied in this norm observance are mutually constituting. Now, I want to broaden our scope just a little bit. I noted in an earlier section when I was talking about the relation between reasons and norms that for Sellars, acting in accordance with a norm is acting on a reason. The antecedent of a binding norm is a reason. Notice, however, that most of the things we have reason to do are socially instituted activities. And so they depend not merely on socially created norms, but on others' observance of those norms. So huge swaths of our social functioning simply cease to make any kind of sense at all if not embedded in a context of interlocking functions, norms, and reasons. Now, Alfred Schutz, for example, writes about what he calls typifying constructs. We use these typifying constructs to anonymize people. In other words, we abstract from their particularity and we assign them specific roles, motives, functions. This allows us to predict their behavior and therefore interact with them as types rather than as individuals. So for example, we don't need to know the identity of the letter carrier to know that putting a letter in the mailbox will result in its being collected and delivered. But there are mutually interlocking roles, functions, and motives which allow interactions among strangers in society to take place. Mutual knowledge of these typifying constructs underlies our division of labor in society. Furthermore, and this is crucial to the overall functioning of the system, these roles, functions, and institutions only exist if people have taken these social norms and largely internalized them. That is, if they largely take them as giving them reasons for action. So I can interact, say, with the cashier at a grocery store, and they can interact with me because we've internalized the relevant norms, and these determine our behavior when interacting. So if they bring up my purchases, I pay, and then I leave with my groceries. So the very existence of the roles and institutions that Searle and Tuomola, Berger and Luckman, Schutz, and all these other people write about, the very existence of these roles and institutions depend as a conceptual matter on members of society, by and large, having internalized these norms. They depend, in other words, on these norms being reasons for them. So in other words, acting on interdependent reasons involves a special kind of what I would call, I guess you could call it a sort of Hegelian mutual recognition. For me to have a reason to do X depends on my classifying your behavior implicitly, usually, as norm governed in a certain way, and therefore involves my taking you to have reasons complementary to my own. Now, Examples can be multiplied basically indefinitely. These examples of institutional interdependence multiply to encompass the overwhelming majority of what we have reason to do as agents. Smith has no reason to submit a paper unless there is somebody who's governed by the norms of grading and evaluation or some similar function. Jones has no reason to solicit assignments if students aren't under a complementary set of reason-giving norms. There's no playing of sports or games without both yourself and others observing norms and hence acting on reasons. As I said, huge swaths of what anyone has reason to do on a given day, from doing your banking or issuing an invoice, writing a report for your boss, surveying some land, rendering an architectural design of a building, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All this is not comprehensible apart from the sets of norms which create the relevant institutions and actions in which give others similar or, again, complementary reasons for action. So you acquire capacities for action in virtue of your position in an interlocking system of institutions, purposes, reasons, and norms, and in virtue of people having internalized these norms and taking them as reasons to do this, that, or the other. So in creating these functions and institutions, society is training people to act on norms. And as I talked about earlier, acting on a norm is acting for a reason, although generally this reason is going to be implicit. So in most of what we do, our having a reason to do it constitutively depends on the reasons of others. No individualistic, in other words, Humean analysis of my reasons is possible. Now, I want to briefly consider an objection before turning around to what the payoff of all of this is, because I think this objection helps clarify the way in which reasons are interdependent. So I think at this point it's natural for the Humean to say that a lot of the above cases that I've been discussing, like the case of a particular play in basketball or the case of buying a computer, a lot of these cases of rational or institutional interdependence, they aren't actually cases of interdependence of reasons. So the Humean might argue that in such cases, my reason, whether it's to buy a computer or to execute a particular play in a sport, the reason doesn't depend on your reason. It merely depends on an expectation about your behavior. Just as virtually any reason I might have will depend on expectations about how some portion of the world is going to behave. So the Humean might argue that we can give an individualistic and still reductive analysis of reasons. We just have to talk about our expectations of other people's behavior, not about their reasons for acting this way, that way, or the other way. Now, I don't think things are actually that simple, either with rational interdependence or with institutional interdependence. I'm briefly going to talk about rational interdependence. So Robert Sugden has argued pretty convincingly that with cases of rational interdependence, what it's rational for me to do depends, for sure, it depends on an expectation of what you will do, but that expectation can only be based on a consideration of what it's rational for you to do, which in turn must be based on a consideration of what it is rational for me to do. So in other words, what it's rational for each of us to do depends on what it's rational for the other to do. There's an interdependence of reasons, and we can't simply replace my reliance on what you have reasons to do with some non-normative notion of my expectations regarding your behavior. But I don't want to dwell on rational interdependence because, like I said, I think the case of institutional interdependence is much more all-pervasive and much more interesting. And I think that studying the case of institutional interdependence gives us a much more profound reason why we cannot explain an individual's interdependent reasons purely in a reductive way. So we can't specify them just in terms of expectation or statistical predictions of others' behavior, rather than explaining them in terms of normative or reason-governed characterizations of others' behavior. So think back to the example of purchasing a computer. So when I buy a computer, I do in fact predict that if I go to the store and hand over my money, I will receive a computer in return. That is a prediction that I make. But if we characterize my action purely in terms of my prediction of other people's behavior, that involves actually a misdescription of my action. It's not to describe my action. So if we describe my action purely in terms of what I predict other people will do, that's not actually describing my action as an instance of buying a computer. For the action of buying a computer does not merely involve walking out of a building with a computer, not even after having left behind a sum of money. Rather, in buying the computer, I'm changing my normative status with respect to the computer and with respect to my money. And I'm also changing the normative status of the seller and the seller's representatives. I'm changing what they have reason to do. In other words, do they have reason to call security or the police when I walk out of the building carrying a computer? Others are now, ceteris paribus, not permitted to interfere with my possession and use of this computer and so on. In fact, I take it that that's largely the point of buying a computer. So in other words, one's reason for buying a computer, indeed, the very characterization of the act as one of buying a computer, is interdependent with the reasons of others. No reductive or individualistic account can be given of it. One can only characterize it as an act of buying by referencing the changing normative status of oneself and of others, and therefore by referencing what they have reason to do or to refrain from doing it. So it turns out that almost any reason we have to act on is a reason that will be interdependent on the reasons of others, perhaps at a conceptual level. So again, at the risk of being tiresomely repetitive, that ship may have sailed, on the Sellarsian account, acting according to a normative propriety, acting according to a normative propriety is acting for a reason, the antecedent of a binding norm as a reason. So what this means is, whenever my reason depends on the norm-governed behavior of others, my reason depends on the reasons of others. And so what this means is that the overwhelming majority of reasons that constitute us as rational agents are only interdefinable with, maybe even conceptually dependent upon, others' reasons. And so the consequence of this is that a faithfully Humean account of reasons, one on which all reasons are individualistic reasons, leads us to a radically impoverished view of rational agency. The reasons that are left, if you have just a Humean account, they don't leave you with much. So to wrap up this section before moving on to what I think is the payoff for objective moral validity, from shopping to conversing to holding meetings to driving to walking in a crowd to stamp collecting, the great majority of human endeavor depends on a system of norms wherein what we have reason to do depends on others' observance of a similar or complementary set of norms, and hence they're being bound by a set of reasons. The interdependence of reasons is a basic feature of human rational agency. So the upshot of this discussion is that our reasons, the reasons we have as social rational agents, cannot be Humean reasons. The Humean condition turns out, after all, not to be the human condition, in that an agent who had only Humean reasons would not be recognizably human. She would be stripped of virtually any kind of reason that would make her intelligible to any of us as being in the space of reasons. So if we restrict our attention to reasons that admit of an individualistic analysis, like the Humean wants us to, we will be excluding from analysis most of the reasons that constitute us as social, rational animals, most of the reasons, that is, that make us distinctive as humans and as persons. When viewed from this perspective, the problem with individualistic analyses like Humean ones isn't merely that they think they can analyze reasons in terms of the desires of individuals. The problem is the deeper one, that they imagine that it is coherent to treat a single individual's reasons as the basic thing to be explained or analyzed in the first place. And it's not. The basic thing to be explained or analyzed is probably the norm, or sets of reasons, sets of interdependent reasons. And in fact, later on in this essay, what I'm going to argue is, in fact, norms and sets of norms are prior to any reasons that anyone could possibly have. So it's an account that forefronts institutions and puts institutions prior to individual reasons. Okay, so the idea that our rational agency is social in this way leads to, I think, the failure of the Humean account of reasons. But this is going to have more of a payoff than that for the Sellarsian, I hope, because our quarry ultimately is objectively binding moral reasons. So the above discussion suggests that the kind of rational agency that is distinctive to humans brings with it a set of reasons that are themselves uniquely social. Now, of course, many of those reasons will be highly contingent not merely on whether a human takes part in this or that institution, but on whether a particular institution happens to even exist within a particular human community or a particular historical period. Obviously, not every community has or has had postal service. But the above discussion also suggests that without taking into account distinctly social reasons, we are left with a radically impoverished conception of human agency, and also of the reasons that are binding on human rational agents. To focus only on reasons that admit of individual analysis is to leave us with a violently truncated agent, one who might not even be an agent. Now, I started off by talking about internal versus external reasons. The debate over internal reasons is often taken to be important because it concerns ultimately the objectivity of morality. So Schroeder, for example, takes the prescriptivity of morality to be an issue in this debate. Finley and Schroeder argued that the very question of moral absolutism is at stake. What I want to know is this. If we reject the individualism of the Humean theory of reasons, and we claim that rational agency requires acting on shared reasons, does this open a path to arguing for the objective bindingness of some reasons, in particular, moral reasons? I'm going to offer a couple of brief arguments for the conclusion that it does. Very brief, but that's what I have time for. Okay. Christine Korsgaard points out that a standard method for trying to argue for the moral point of view, and this method is on full display with the Humean theory of reasons and authors like Schroeder, is to assume that the individual agent has private reasons, that is, reasons that have normative force for her, and then they try to argue that those private reasons give the individual some reason to take the private reasons of others into account. That's a standard method of trying to argue for the objectivity of morality. Such a strategy of starting with private reasons, however, is doomed to fail. Korsgaard thinks, she says, arguments that try to move us from private reasons to public reasons suffer from certain standard defects. Consistency can force me to grant that your humanity is normative for you, just as mine is normative for me, but it does not force me to share in your reasons or make your humanity normative for me. So as Korsgaard writes, to argue that rationality inherently involves public as opposed to private reasons. So Korsgaard suggests that we go about the justification of morality in a totally different way. She says, how about if we started with public reasons instead of private reasons? She said, to argue that rationality inherently involves public as opposed to purely private reasons would almost, although not quite, amount to showing that morality does not need a justification. Pritchard would be right. After all, moral philosophy would indeed rest on a mistake if moral philosophy is the attempt to argue us from having private reasons into having public ones. Now, the strategies, okay, thank you. The strategy suggested by this approach that I've been advocating, this approach that takes reasons and rationality to be inherently social. So the strategy suggested by the Sellarsian approach, which holds to the inherently social nature of reasons, is to hold that reasons are already, by their nature, inherently public, to occupy the standpoint of rational agency is to occupy the standpoint of the we, and to be bound by its norms, including its moral norms. So this is the basic strategy that's suggested by starting from the recognition that reasons are inherently social in nature, reasons are inherently public in nature. That's the basic strategy. A consequence of Sellars' social conception of human agency is going to be that a lot of our reasons, and indeed fundamental social institutions, depend on interdependent reasons, that to be a rational agent requires a kind of Hegelian mutual recognition, a recognition of others acting on and being bound by reasons. So to be a rational agent, to be a creature capable of acting on reasons, is a fortiori to be a member of the we, a creature who acknowledges others as rational agents, and who is only capable of acting on reasons, and hence only capable of rational agency, insofar as she submits to the norms and institutions of her community. So in other words, she is only capable of rational agency insofar as she is already a member of the we. Now, what this means concretely is this. Since the overwhelming majority of the reasons we act on qua rational agents constitutively depend on the reasons of other agents, the very idea of acting on reasons implies commitment to the existence of a community and to the existence of other rational agents. It may not be easy to draw out this relation of dependence, but the dependence is there, and hence no rational agent can find herself without reasons to promote the interests of the community and of other agents. So this is not an attempt to move from private reasons to public reasons. So it's, in other words, it's not an attempt to say, I have reasons, and so I have to recognize the reasons of others. No, to reason at all is to deploy public reasons, to be part of the community, and hence subject to the community's norms. This is why Sellars can claim in chapter 7 of Science and Metaphysics that the concept of rational agency itself entails the objective validity of the supreme principle of morality. To be a rational agent is to be thickly constituted and bound by the norms of a particular community, which itself is under the ongoing imperative to make the psychology of its members conform to its central tenets. To be a rational agent just is to be bound by the central norms of a community, including a fortiori those that are necessary for the community's continued existence and welfare. So Sellars can plausibly argue that rational agency itself implies the validity of the moral point of view. Now, those who are in the grip of Williams's view of reasons in the Humean theory, in other words, those who really think that there can only be internal reasons, that if you don't have the relevant desire, then you can't have a reason to do the action in question, or that you think that reasons have to admit of an individual analysis. So those in the grip of this conception of reasons are surely going to object. They're going to say, hey, surely there are people who are not motivated to promote the welfare of the community, people who are rational agents, yet who are motivated only by social selfish concerns, right? Surely we can imagine such people. And as I indicated earlier, Schroeder and other writers after Bernard Williams worry that this means that moral norms are not binding on these people. If they don't have the proper motivation, then they have no reason to act on these norms, and therefore the argument is supposed to go, these norms aren't binding on them. Thanks. I think Sellars is going to deny that any such thing follows. Let us suppose that there are rational agents who have no commitment to ethical norms. And let us further suppose that for this individual, there is no way to reach these ethical norms from their subjective motivational set. That is, these norms are external in Williams's sense. So we might grant then that this person has no internal reason in Williams's sense to follow these ethical norms. Does it follow that these norms are not binding on that person? Now, to draw this conclusion is again to fall prey to the individualism of the Humean. Implicit or explicit in much of the Humean discussion is an attempt to reduce not merely all reasons to desires, but the thought that all normative institutions must themselves be grounded solipsistically in the desires of each individual. So morality is only binding on me if we can show how I, in particular, have an internalist reason to be moral, a reason grounded in my individual psychology. But why would you think that? It ignores the fact that the very constitution of community requires that some set of the community's norms be taken as binding on all members of the community, regardless of their motivational set. That is a condition on the possibility of rational community. And most members of the community must actually internalize these binding norms. So the whole point of training each generation is to make their psychology conform to our existing institutions, not because we think they have internalist reasons to comply with these institutions. As per the internalist, they can't possibly have such reasons until they have the proper psychology, but instead because communal and institutional imperatives require the imposition of institutional norms upon each member of society, irrespective of their psychology. So I think the important lesson to be gleaned here is the anti-individualistic one, that the bindingness of institutional norms is conceptually and normatively prior to any so-called individualist reasons a person might have or indeed could possibly have. So in Sellarsian terms, various ought-to-bes are applicable to trainees in advance of their possessing the appropriate psychology, and trainers condition these trainees in accordance with these ought-to-bes in order to make their psychology conform to the relevant institutional norms. So the institutional norms are binding, as it were, prior to the trainees having the appropriate psychology. Getting them to have the appropriate psychology is the point of training them in the first place. So we are again led to the conclusion that rational agency and the concomitant membership in a community can make the agent subject to certain objectively valid norms imposed by membership in said community, whatever the agent's psychology happens to be. Okay, concluding. So Sellars has a radically social conception of the person and of rational agency. And I think by tracing out the consequences of this radically social conception of rational agency, we're able to draw a couple of conclusions. First, the Humean theory of reasons offers an overly simplified conception of what reasons are. Once we understand that most of our reasons are inherently social and intersubjective, we see that the Humean theory of reasons is unable to account for them. Second, to be a rational agent is to be a member of a community bound by its norms and subject to various social reasons, among them moral reasons. Now, Sellars is not explicit as to whether this means everyone has some kind of moral motive, but he is clear that it means that moral norms are binding on every rational agent. So Sellars' solution is a little difficult to situate within Williams's internalism-externalism dichotomy. But the important lesson is that reasons are not a matter of individual psychology, but are instead inherently social. And as one is subject to moral reasons insofar as one is bound by the norms of the relevant social practice. This is a crucial consequence of Sellars' social conception of persons and of rational agency. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. That was terrific. So it's time for questions. You can use the raise hand function or wave at me if you're having a hard time finding that. Danielle, Macbeth.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was really very interesting. I wanted to ask about I'm interested. You don't make much distinction at all between the social and the rational, and it seems to me just as you couldn't have social beings if you didn't have living beings, but we're not merely living; we are social. And I think I would want to say you can't have rational beings that aren't social beings, but being rational isn't the same as being social,
right?
At least as I understand it. So being rational is having these capacities of critical reflection.
Mhm.
And you have to already have been socialized.
Mhm.
You know, you can't achieve rationality without having second nature, having been brought up a certain way. But I still take those two things to be different. And indeed, listening to you, I sort of, you know, I'm trying to think, well, what makes something moral rather than, you know, just any old reason? What makes something a moral reason?
Right.
And it seems to me that although you're absolutely right, many of our reasons are grounded in the social. I take it that having a moral reason is rather distinctive, and as I understand Sellars, has something to do with the fact that as rational, we have to put some critical distance to the social, so that we have to be capable of being critically reflective of the social context that we have. And that's where I think a kind of individualism comes back in. So I want to say, don't we need to separate a little bit the social from the rational, just as we have to separate the social from the living?
Yeah.
They're different
No,
stages.
I think that's a fair point. And you know, some of this we touched on a little bit in yesterday's discussion. And you know, I think at the end of the day that we have some basic disagreements about you know, whether the Sellarsian moral project can ultimately succeed. But I think you're right. I mean, there has to be, at the end of the day, some distance between the social and the rational, especially when it comes to morality, because the moral can't just be the social for Sellars, because there's always going to be I feel like I mentioned this yesterday in the discussion. You know, Sellars has this quote. I think it's on reason. No, I'm about to say on reasoning about value, but my brain's failing now. I can't remember, where he says, you know, it will be remembered. I don't just ask who are we, but shareable by whom, right? And so this idea that Sellars has is that the rational pressure is for us to treat as a member of the rational community anyone who's capable of sharing these kinds of intentions. And of course, Brandon picks this up later. You know, you look at something like freedom and constraint by norms, where Brandon says to treat something as being in the space of reasons rather than in the space merely as in the space of causes is to translate their utterances, right? And I feel like that's something he just got directly from Sellars, right? You know, if you can treat them as making linguistically meaningful utterances, they can exercise their language users, they can share in these intentions. Then even if in a sense they're not part of your social community, they're part of the larger rational community. So yeah, I think that's actually, I think you're right. I think I don't very distinctly. I don't think I very clearly distinguish between social and rational, and I think you're right. For Sellars, that is an important distinction, and it's one I need to make more of.
Great. Heath White.
Thank you, Jeremy. I thought that was just particularly as a reply to Bernard Williams. I thought that was brilliant. That was really great.
Thank you.
I actually have two questions, and I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll just ask one, and if there's time later, I'll ask another one. But so this question is, you distinguished early on between rational interdependence and institutional interdependence.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a sort of friendly suggestion, what do you think about the following suggestion? That the institutional situation is a kind of refinement or development of the rational interdependence. And what I mean is, like, if I wanted to send a letter to somebody, I could arrange a one-off courier, you know, and now that's a collective action problem. I'm going to pay him some money and he's going to take my letter to the destination or whatever. But that's, you know, hard to arrange and it's a big pain. So we create a post office and we give people a certain job as letter carrier. And now there's a way to do it. And now we've created an institution. So maybe we could think of institutions as, you know, sort of standing solutions to collective action problems. And that just makes them refinements or developments of, you know, that makes your institutional dependence a sort of development of your rational interdependence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I quite like that suggestion. And I think that fits in nicely with some of the, you know, the more game theoretic approaches to institutions and morality in particular. Thank you for that suggestion, actually. Writing it all down in my little notebook here.
All right.
Stephanie.
Okay, thanks a lot for the talk. I have two questions. I think maybe merely clarificatory. I wasn't sure about your use of internalized. You said that that social norms are internalized by people, and you you said that that means that people take the norms to provide reasons for their action. But I thought that was it. Maybe it's just my understanding of internalizing, but that was a strange way of using internalizing, because for me, internalizing a norm means something like automatization, like the norm getting on a level where it's not reflected anymore, but like behaving according to the norm becomes automatized, and not people taking the norm to provide a reason, because precisely these automatized norms, we cannot take them like directly to provide reasons for our actions, because they are internalized, they are automated, like keeping the right social distance, for example. Yeah, that's regulated by norms. It's different for each culture, but normally we do not reflect on these things, and they do not provide reasons directly. Yeah, and if you ask me why I keep precisely the distance that I keep from you, then I could not even spell that out as a reason. Yeah, so I wasn't sure about that use of internalized. Maybe we could say recognized, that norms are recognized. I'm not sure. Yeah. And a second question. I wasn't so sure in the end if I understood what it means to say that a reason is social on your account, because you had that computer buying example. Yeah. And of course, I understand that this whole practice of buying and selling, that this is dependent on institutions of property and so forth, everything that you have explained. I understand that. But what does it then mean to say that the reason for buying a computer, for example, is a social reason? Because I might want to buy a computer because I want to have fun. I want to play computer games. In what sense would that be a social reason? So maybe I thought that we must distinguish here between saying that we can have probably almost all of our reasons only because there are institutions, for example. Yeah, because otherwise we wouldn't have the practices which we needed the reasons for, couldn't do the things which we needed the reasons for. So in that sense, I couldn't have a reason for buying a computer if there weren't all these institutions, because there wouldn't be a practice of buying computers. Yeah, that would be one part. And then the other part saying that some of these reasons are interdependent, where I have to think about the other's reasons for doing his actions and thereby to figure out my own reasons. Yeah, that these seem to be two things which we need to keep apart, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah. So as for internalize, thank you. I'm glad that so if that's not clear, then that's something I need to clarify in the paper. Really, I'm thinking of something. So I guess basically along the lines of Jim's norm nature meta principle, that norms for norms to for a norm to actually be instituted in society, it has to be realized in people's psychology. That's really all I mean, is that institutions don't exist unless the institutional norms are actually made real in people's psychology, such that people actually act on them. And that's all I mean about that. And what this might actually mean for the contentious claim this might depend on is that when you act on a norm, and as you see, I rely on this claim throughout the paper, is that the circumstances of action are your reason. So, if you're the cashier at a supermarket, the norm is that if someone brings groceries to the register, you check them out. So that's the norm, right? So then if you check someone out, your reason for checking them out will be that they brought groceries to the register. So that's what I mean, is that there's a norm, and then the antecedent being satisfied is your reason for then, executing the consequent of the norm. So that's basically what I mean by that. That's the picture I'm trying to paint. As for reasons being social, so yeah, I agree that so the reason you want to have a computer is because it's fun, but also you want to actually own the computer, right? So that you have control over it, and your ownership of the computer. It's not just that you want to have a computer so that you can have fun with it. You actually want the computer to be yours. You have a reason. You can't just go into the computer store and play Fortnite or whatever on the computer that they have at the computer store, right? You have to actually make it yours, right? So if you have a good reason to get a computer to play games on or to do whatever on, you have a reason to buy the computer. But again, you can't have these sorts of reasons unless other people have the sort of complementary kinds of reasons. Like we can't even talk about what it means for you to buy the computer unless we talk about the reasons you're buying the computer gives other people. So that's what I mean about the reasons being interdependent. We can't talk about your reasons. You couldn't have a reason to buy a computer unless you're doing it gave other people reasons, basically, is what I'm trying to say. They're interdependent in that way. Does that clarify at all? I'm not asking you if you agree. I'm just asking if that makes the position more clear.
It helps. Thank you.
Okay, great.
All right, Rebecca.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I was very, very convinced, and I'm really kind of glad to have this argument as a kind of argument in my toolkit for sort of next time I come across someone who's very devoted to a sort of individualistic picture of reasons. So
thank you.
Yes, thank you for, for writing it up. My question was sort of thinking about, one of the things that I really like about the way that you are sort of presenting the argument and the sort of role of norms in the argument and thinking about the kinds of interdependence with reasons, was thinking also about sort of things like the role of sanctioning in relation to norms, and sort of thinking about how, maybe sort of one of the strengths about viewing this in relation to norms is we can also talk about how the sort of practices of sort of sanctioning people who are sort of either sort of failing to live up to the norms or sort of failing to sort of act on the sort of reasons that they ought to have given the sort of norms present, that kind of those practices of sanctioning are part of what gives reasons on a sort of individual level their motivational force. So the fact that we're sort of constantly surrounded by these norms and also the kind of corresponding practice of sanctioning. And so I think that in a sort of social scorekeeping context, thinking about the norms and the reasons that you take yourself to have versus the ones that are attributed to you, and in some cases, the ones that you are sort of sanctioned for not taking yourself to have.
Right.
I think that sort of adds a lot of weight to your picture. So I was wondering if kind of this is basically just me agreeing with you, or whether you see that as something kind of basically, am I saying basically what you want to say when you're talking about that slightly different?
No, I think that's actually like I would consider that to be like a friendly addition to what's going on here. What I was really trying to bring out at the end, and I don't know how clearly I brought this out, is that because you have these things, because so many of these reasons are institutional in nature, I think you really have to focus on, like I said, I think in a lot of cases, the institutions and the norms that generate these institutions are actually kind of in the order of explanation, kind of prior to the reasons that people have. And so, society perpetuates and generates these institutions by imposing these norms on people, and making people such that their psychology conforms to the relevant norms and institutions, right? So there's a sense in which, sort of both temporally and conceptually, the norm exists before the person's psychology, which is and before the internalist reasons in Bernard Williams' sense. And I think that sanctions are an important part of the way in which psychology, the way in which a given social unit creates that conformity and does that psychological shaping. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it. I hadn't really thought very much specifically about the mechanisms. Like I said, Sellars talks about trainers and trainees, but he doesn't really talk that much about the mechanisms. But yeah, no, I think that's sort of like, I would regard that as like an addition to the picture of how, but it's more of the picture of how the sort of, as I said, I think that the sort of Williams internalist picture just has things just completely backwards in terms of the order of explanation of where reasons come from, and when you talk about reasons versus the bindingness of norms.
Thanks.
Sure.
All right, Nicholas.
Hey, thanks. I really like that. One question for you, though. You said to occupy the standpoint of rational agency is to recognize others' reasons, to recognize oneself as a part of a we. Why does it require you to recognize yourself as a part of a maximally large we? Because that's the we you have to be a part of to have moral significance in Sellars' picture.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit that none of what I said here shows that. I mean, I flatter myself that I have an argument that that shows that the moral community can be extended, but I mean, my argument is basically an extrapolation of other things that Sellars has said. Like I said, if and it's more of what I basically said in response to Danielle, which is I think ultimately for Sellars, if a person is capable of sharing the relevant we intentions with you, then it's an exercise of bad faith for you not to treat them as part of the moral community. That's the short version of the argument. And ultimately, an argument for the maximal reach of the moral community for Sellars is going to have to take that form. And that's not an argument I give here at all in this paper. So you're absolutely right. This paper does nothing to establish that. I'm going to just agree with you on that.
Jim.
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for that. That was a wonderful talk. And my question is just sort of a version of some of the ones that have just been made about the rational versus the social. But I'm just interested in a certain trivial question about when Sellars says that his view is a thoroughly Kantian metaphysics of morals. My question is sort of, if you look at Korsgaard, I would think the way that she tries to argue will ultimately be, there's this general anti-Bernard Williams, anti-Humean type of argument that talks about humanity as in the setting of ends and freedom and acting under the idea of freedom and so on. And these sorts of Kantian constructivist views sometimes link up seemingly with some things you want to do, but it seems a very different way of doing things, where you just argue directly from something about the idea of a rational being as a setter of ends, and then how you have to respect others in that way. And you can take that Kantian constructivist, you can try to support that in various ways, but it seems different from the ways that Sellars or you or your Sellars wants to do it. The Nicholas seemed to come close to it. I wouldn't want to try to restate his view, but and do you think the most trivial form of that question is just, do you think Sellars realized that? Is there anywhere you've read all of his work? I mean, I've just about done the same. And I feel like I remember some passage, but I can't find it, where he registers that he's not doing it exactly Kant's way in this, that there's a more ambitious argument about the universality of practical rationality as it relates to freedom and the setting of ends. Is that right, that that's a difference from Sellars and from your view or your reading of Sellars? And does Sellars register that anywhere, that his view is not really a thoroughly Kantian view in that sense?
I think so, yes, but it's I mean, I'll be honest that, and I think that one of my issues with Sellars on this is that he's so very vague on it. I mean, because so I mean you've read some of my stuff on where, you know, I try to argue that Sellars' derivation of the moral point of view represents you know, an attempt to demonstrate autonomy, because he's trying to demonstrate, you know, that it follows from the notion of finite rational agency, that we're subject to the moral point of view, and I think that's right. So I do think that it's very Kantian in that respect, but I think that and I think it is this sort of kingdom of ends argument, because, you know, because of this very brief argument that he outlines at the end of Science and Metaphysics, where he says that you know, I think ultimately it does amount to this Kantian kingdom of ends argument, because I think ultimately the argument is going to be something like to be a finite rational agent among other finite rational agents, to be an end-setter among other end-setters, is to itself be the kind of person who has to care about the community of end-setters. But I think the difference between, but here's I think the difference between Sellars and between Sellars and Kant, and I really think this is, I don't think I'm just reading this back into Sellars, as I really think that Sellars does take this Korsgaardian move of starting with public reasons. And I think that's the thing that Kant gets wrong and Sellars gets right. And that's the thing that Korsgaard identifies as being really the Achilles heel of so many of these moral philosophers who try to do this private to public move. And Kant says, and Sellars says, no, if you're reasoning, then you're already a member of the team, as it were. You're already part of the kingdom of ends, because to be an end setter is to be a member of the kingdom of end setters. That's kind of the best I have on this.
That itself might be close to what Kant was. He's happy to start with the public conception of reason. Thanks.
Sure.
I see there's just over a minute left in this session. And Zachary, do you have a question, comment?
Sorry, I was bad on timing. I don't think I can make my question super quick. Actually, I can make one observation that was going to be part of a bigger question, but is maybe just in this context, just like a small nitpicky question. So I noticed that a lot of what you call interdependence of reasons seems to me like something that some people might not really think of as, strictly speaking, a dependence relation, but rather like kind of necessary connection that's constituted by a broader network of dependence relations. So like say in the pick and roll case, but I think also in the institutional cases, it's like my reason doesn't, strictly speaking, according to some uses of the word dependence, depend on your reasons, but rather it depends on something which also necessarily grounds your having reasons. That is, like, my reasons depend on a certain kind of institution of institutional practice of buying and selling, or an established play of there being a pick and roll, and that grounds the other person's reason. I'm not sure this is super important, but I just say this because I have a professor who taught me to be nitpicky about talking about dependence this way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's fair. So, I mean, surely that our reasons depend on the institutions in that way. But also, I think in particular cases, like when it's actually time to execute the action, now your reasons also depend. Yeah, I mean, I can't make the case right now. We have basically we're basically out of time, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think there's both those kinds of dependence, right? There's relation on institutional norms, which is a different kind of dependence. But then, like in the particular case, when now the circumstances are such that a pick and roll is the perfect move to execute, now, you know, my reason to do it is dependent on, you know, your reason to do the same thing, just like the quarterback's reason to pass the ball downfield is, you know, and the wide receiver's reason to run a particular route are also interdependent on each other. So I think there's also that sort of horizontal dependence as well.
All right. Thank you again, Jeremy. That was terrific. Let's thank Jeremy one more time.
Thank you. Thank you.